Do you know the Bible describes gigantic constructions built thousands of years before modern engineering? Some were built with unimaginable wealth, some collapsed in mysterious ways. Structures that still leave scientists asking how. Journey with me as we uncover the 5 biggest constructions in the Bible, and some secrets they hide. The last one will leave you speechless. These are not myths. These are structures that shaped the course of human history. Noah's Ark, the vessel that saved humanity, the divine commission. The world before the flood was drowning in corruption. Violence ruled every corner of the earth. And according to Genesis chapter 6, God looked upon humanity and was grieved that he had made them. But there was one man, one family, still righteous in his sight, Noah. And God gave him a task that would have seemed impossible to any rational mind. Build a vessel large enough to preserve every kind of animal life on earth. Build it inland, far from any sea. Build it before a catastrophe that had never happened before. And build it before time ran out. The dimensions, engineering the impossible. The dimensions recorded in Genesis are shockingly precise. 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Converting this to modern measurements, that's approximately 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. The total displacement would have been around 43,000 tons, the equivalent of more than 500 railroad freight cars. To put this in perspective, Noah's Ark was larger than a standard football field and remained the largest wooden vessel ever documented until the late 1800s, when steam-powered iron-hulled ships finally surpassed it. But Noah wasn't building with steel. He was building with gopher wood, likely a type of cypress sealed with pitch using Bronze Age tools. No cranes. No machinery, no blueprints except the instructions whispered by God. And he did it with only his 3 sons helping him over what scholars estimate to be between 55 and 75 years of relentless labor. Imagine the mockery, the doubt, the isolation, every single day. But Noah kept building. The global flood, evidence beneath our feet. The biblical account describes a global deluge that covered even the highest mountains. Water erupting from beneath the earth. Rain falling for 40 days and 40 nights without stopping. For centuries, skeptics dismissed this as pure mythology. But modern geology has uncovered something extraordinary. Evidence of catastrophic flooding exists across every continent. Marine fossils, shells, coral, sea creatures have been discovered on the peaks of the Himalayas, the Andes, and the Rocky Mountains. Sedimentary rock layers show signs of rapid, violent deposition, not the slow accumulation predicted by conventional models. Even more compelling, nearly every ancient culture on Earth possesses flood legends. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia, the Atrahasis epic from Babylon, Hindu accounts of Manu, Greek myths of Deucalion, Chinese legends of Gunyu. Different cultures, different languages, different continents, but always the flood. The Ararat anomaly, a ship on a mountain. In 1948, a Kurdish shepherd noticed something strange on a remote mountainside near Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey, a formation shaped exactly like a massive ship. Since then, researchers using ground-penetrating radar have discovered what appear to be internal chambers, parallel walls, and metal rivets embedded in the structure. The dimensions? Approximately 515 feet long. Strikingly close to the biblical measurement of 300 cubits. Soil samples taken from inside the formation reveal marine clay deposits and fossilized sea life, suggesting the area was once submerged under massive amounts of water. Organic material found nearby has been carbon dated to between 3,500 and 5,000 years old. Skeptics argue it's a natural rock formation shaped by erosion. Some geologists agree, others remain unconvinced. But one thing is undeniable. This structure matches the Bible's description with eerie precision, and it sits exactly where Genesis says the ark came to rest, on the mountains of Ararat. The walls of Jericho, the collapse that defied physics, the siege that wasn't. The Israelites had wandered 40 years in the desert. An entire generation had died in the wilderness. But now, under Joshua's command, they stood at the threshold of the Promised Land. And blocking their path was Jericho, one of the most heavily fortified cities in all of Canaan. The walls were not symbolic. Archaeological excavations have revealed a double fortification system. A massive stone retaining wall 12 to 15 feet high at the base, topped by a thick mud brick wall 6 to 8 feet wide and over 20 feet tall, impenetrable by Bronze Age siege tactics. But God gave Joshua a battle plan that made no military sense whatsoever. March around the city once a day for 6 days in complete silence. On the 7th day, march 7 times. Then blow the trumpets. Shout with all your strength. And watch the walls fall. The collapse outward, not inward. On the 7th day, exactly as commanded, the Israelites marched. The priests blew the ram's horn trumpets. The people shouted with a unified roar. And the walls of Jericho fell. But here's what makes this extraordinary from an archaeological standpoint. The walls didn't fall inward, as they would under a battering ram assault or enemy sabotage. They fell outward, collapsing down the slope and forming perfect ramps of rubble that allowed the Israelites to charge straight up and into the city from all sides simultaneously. British archaeologist Dame Kathleen Kenyon, excavating in the 1950s, found exactly this. She wrote in her report, "The destruction was complete. Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks." But she also noted something peculiar. The mud brick walls had collapsed before the city was burned, not as a result of the fire. Exactly as Joshua chapter 6 describes. The earthquake theory, but how did they know? Both archaeologist John Garstang in the 1930s and Kathleen Kenyon decades later found clear evidence of seismic activity at the time of Jericho's destruction. Walls had shifted out of alignment. Floors buckled, the unmistakable signature of an earthquake. Many scholars now propose that God may have used a precisely timed earthquake to bring down the walls. But this raises an even deeper mystery. How could the Israelites have predicted the exact moment to march, blow trumpets, and shout in unison? Earthquakes are fundamentally unpredictable. Yet the biblical account describes the collapse happening in perfect synchronization with their obedience. Either this was the most astronomically fortunate coincidence in military history, or something beyond natural forces was orchestrating every detail. Rahab's house, the one section that stood. One final archaeological detail aligns perfectly with Scripture. In Joshua chapter 2, the Israelite spies were hidden by a woman named Rahab, a prostitute whose house was built into the city wall itself. When the walls collapsed, Rahab and her family were miraculously spared. Her section of the wall remained standing. German archaeologists in the early 1900s discovered a section of Jericho's northern wall that had not collapsed. Houses were found still attached to this section, homes built directly into the fortification. Skeptics call it coincidence. Believers see divine precision written into the rubble. Solomon's Temple, the house covered in gold. The vision. King David had united the 12 tribes of Israel. He had established Jerusalem as the eternal capital. He had brought the Ark of the Covenant to rest in the city. But there was one thing he desired above all else, to build a permanent house for the Lord, a temple worthy of God's presence. God refused him. David was a man of war. His hands had shed too much blood to build a house of peace. But God promised, "Your son will build it." And so Solomon, upon ascending to the throne, received the sacred blueprints that David had been given by divine revelation. And he began construction on what would become the most magnificent structure the ancient world had ever seen. The materials, wealth beyond imagination. The temple was not large by modern standards. Only 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high, about the size of a modest modern church. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in sheer, breathtaking opulence. The walls were lined with intricately carved cedar from Lebanon, trees so valuable they were considered the currency of kings. Every surface inside the temple was overlaid with pure gold. Not gold leaf, not gold paint, solid gold plating. 1 Kings 6 verse 22 states explicitly that Solomon overlaid the entire interior with gold. The floor, the walls, the ceiling, the altar, even the massive cherubim in the Holy of Holies, carved from olive wood, were completely covered in hammered gold. Scholars estimate the total amount of gold used would exceed 25 tons. In today's market, that's valued at over $1.5 billion, And that doesn't even account for the silver, bronze, and countless precious stones. Recent archaeological discoveries at ancient copper mines in Jordan, dating to the 10th century BCE, reveal that workers there were dressed in finely dyed, expensive clothing, not the ragged garments of slaves. This confirms the biblical narrative. Solomon's kingdom was immensely wealthy. The dedication when God moved in. When construction was complete, Solomon gathered all of Israel for the dedication ceremony. The Ark of the Covenant, containing the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, was carried into the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple. The priests withdrew. Solomon knelt and prayed. And then, according to 1 Kings 8 verse 10 to 11, something extraordinary occurred. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord. And the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. The Shekinah glory, the visible, physical manifestation of God's presence, descended like a pillar of cloud and fire. It filled the temple so completely that the priests couldn't even stand inside. For the first time since the Garden of Eden, God was dwelling with humanity in a permanent structure. The temple stood for over 400 years before being destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. But its memory, that has lasted forever. The Tower of Babel, the ziggurat of pride, the unified world. After the flood, humanity spoke one language. They shared one culture, one vision, and they migrated eastward into the fertile plains of Shinar, the land we now call Iraq. There, on the banks of the Euphrates River, they made a decision that would echo through all of history. They would build a city and a tower whose top would reach into the heavens themselves, not to worship God, but to make a name for themselves. Genesis 11:4 records their exact words. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. This was not devotion. This was defiance. The Etemenanke, Babylon's stairway to heaven. In 1913, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey uncovered the foundation of a colossal structure buried beneath the sands of Babylon. It was called Etemenanke, which translates to the Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, a seven-tiered ziggurat, approximately 300 feet tall and 300 feet wide at the base, comparable in height to a modern 30-story building. It was constructed from millions of baked bricks, sealed together with bitumen tar. Exactly the materials described in Genesis 11 verse 3. Cuneiform inscriptions from King Nebuchadnezzar to himself describe his reconstruction of this tower centuries later. He boasts in the inscription, "I raised its top to the heavens," the exact phrase used in the Bible. The Babylonians believed this ziggurat was the axis mundi, the cosmic center of the universe, where heaven and earth physically connected. At the very top was a lavish temple with bedrooms prepared for the gods, who the priests claimed regularly descended from the heavens to spend the night. This was humanity's attempt to force access to the divine realm on their own terms, to climb up to God's level rather than humbly receive his invitation. And God shut it down. The confusion of languages. Genesis 11 verse 7 records God's response. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. And in an instant, the unified language of humanity fractured into dozens, then hundreds of distinct, mutually incomprehensible tongues. Modern linguistic studies show that all human languages can be traced back to a relatively small number of proto-language families, suggesting a single point of divergence in humanity's distant past. The Tower of Babel was never destroyed by earthquake or war. It was simply abandoned, left unfinished, incomplete, because the workers could no longer communicate. Archaeology confirms this. The Etemenanke was rebuilt multiple times over centuries by Hammurabi, by Nebuchadnezzar, even by Alexander the Great, who attempted to restore it, but it was never completed according to its original design. It stands today as a crumbled ruin in the deserts of Iraq, a monument to human pride and divine intervention. The Second Temple, rebuilt from exile, the return from exile. In 586 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Solomon's temple. The gold was looted, the walls burned to ash, the Holy of Holies left empty and defiled. For 70 years, the Jewish people lived in exile in Babylon. But in 538 BCE, something miraculous happened. King Cyrus of Persia, a pagan king, issued a decree that the Jews could return to Jerusalem, and they could rebuild the temple. Led by Zerubbabel the governor and Joshua the high priest, the returning exiles laid the foundation of what would become the Second Temple. But when the older priests, those who had seen Solomon's temple in all its glory before the destruction, saw the new foundation being laid, many of them wept openly, because it was nothing like what had been lost. The glory was gone, the wealth was gone, the grandeur was a memory, Herod's expansion, beauty restored. Centuries later, King Herod the Great, a ruler desperate for political legitimacy and historical legacy, undertook a massive expansion project that would transform the Second Temple into one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. He doubled the size of the Temple Mount platform, creating one of the largest religious complexes ever constructed. He covered the temple facade in brilliant white marble and gold plating. He built massive colonnades, expansive courtyards, and monumental gates. The Jewish historian Josephus, who saw the temple with his own eyes, wrote that it shone so brilliantly in the desert sunlight that pilgrims approaching Jerusalem from a distance had to shield their eyes. The temple became not just a place of worship, but the economic, political, and social heart of Jewish life. The Sanhedrin, the supreme judicial court, met in the hall of hewn stones within the temple complex. Thousands of priests rotated through daily service. Pilgrims from across the Roman Empire journeyed to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the great festivals. It was here that Jesus taught. It was here that he overturned the tables of the money changers. It was here that he prophesied its coming destruction. The destruction and the legacy. In 70 CE, after a brutal 4-year rebellion against Roman occupation, the Roman general Titus besieged Jerusalem. On the 9th of AV, the same date Solomon's temple had been destroyed 656 years earlier, Roman soldiers set fire to the Second Temple. The flames consumed the inner chambers. The heat was so intense that the gold plating melted and ran between the stones. Roman soldiers, hoping to collect the gold, pried apart the massive blocks stone by stone. Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled with terrible precision. Not one stone will be left on another. Over 1 million people died in the siege. The survivors were sold into slavery or executed. The Jewish nation was scattered across the Roman Empire in what would become a 1,900-year exile. The Western Wall, the last remaining section of the Temple Mount's retaining wall, still stands today as a place of prayer and mourning. But the temple itself? Gone. And it has never been rebuilt. Conclusion: living temples, 5 constructions, 5 monuments to the intersection of the divine and the human. Noah's Ark, a vessel of salvation that preserved life through judgment. The walls of Jericho, a barrier that fell not to human strength, but to obedience and faith. Solomon's Temple, a house of gold where heaven touched earth. The Tower of Babel, a monument to pride that was never finished. And the Second Temple, a place of worship that was destroyed, but whose spiritual legacy endures. These structures continue to leave scientists speechless not just because of their scale or their engineering, but because of what they represent. They remind us that the material world is not all that exists, that history is not random, that there are forces at work, both human and divine, that shape the course of civilizations. And perhaps most importantly, they point to a truth expressed by the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Corinthians. Do you not know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you? The physical temples may be gone, but the call to become living temples, vessels of divine presence in a broken world, remains. That is the construction project that still continues today. If this journey through history opened your eyes to the mysteries hidden in the ancient texts, then our work here is just beginning. Subscribe for more deep dives into the Bible's greatest mysteries, the stories that science, archaeology, and faith are still trying to fully understand. Because the past is never really past. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next mystery.